So we're back. Now we're going to look at whether or not meter is always consistent, and it isn't. Now there are some poets that never had a single variation, but for the most part, there's a little bit of, I don't think it's cheating, but there's a little bit of differences from line to line. So there are a lot of terms that I could give you to name all of the various exceptions. We're not going to learn them, but I do want you to be aware that it happens so that when you're, let's say you're practicing something and you're looking at the meter and you're thinking, well, this doesn't really work out. It's nothing because it doesn't fit exactly. Actually, we look for the meter that is mostly consistent, and then we just note the variations. So let's take this example. So I've given you down here are two lines from the very, very beginning of a poem called Evangeline by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And it goes like this. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks, bearded with moss and in garments green, indistinct in the twilight. Okay, and it's a very long poem. It's actually a pretty cool poem. Anyway, we're going to take a look at the scansion of these lines and see. We're going to see that it mostly follows a particular pattern, but Longfellow definitely mixes it up a little bit. Okay. So what I found is that the poem begins with a stressed. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring. And let's just stop there for a second. How did I figure that out? Well, first, if I try to force an iambic or trochaic pattern on this poem, it just doesn't work. So let's try trochaic, where the stress comes first. This is the forest. No, I know right away that can't work because we don't say the word forest. So it can't be that. So let's try to make it iambic. This is the forest primeval. No, also doesn't work. We don't say this is the forest primeval. Really, it's primeval. So here, knowing how to pronounce the word primeval is very helpful. So this is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks. Okay. So you can see the line begins with a stressed syllable, is followed by two unstressed syllables, and the pattern repeats until the very end, and then we got to figure out what to do with this end. So let's see it with the feet marked. So my pattern was 3 syllables, so I know it's going to be either anapestic or dactylic. So this is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks. So what do we end with? Well, we actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 6 feet. Skip on to the next one here. So each foot contains 3 syllables in a stressed, unstressed, unstressed pattern. That makes it dactylic. Now, if you weren't paying much attention, you might have missed the fact that the last foot only has 2 syllables. Okay, so you might just call this one dactylic hexameter and move on. But there's a slight variation in the end. So while it does have 6 feet, one of the feet is not a dactyl. It only has 2 syllables, which means it's either a trochet or an iamb. And because it is stressed, unstressed, that makes it a trochet. Okay, let's take a look at the second line and see if maybe it does the same thing. Bearded with moss and in garments green, indistinct in the twilight. That one's trickier. Let's see what this one looks like. Bearded with moss, that works, and in garments green, indistinct. Garments green, I think you could make a case. I kind of forced a little bit of this pattern, but I think you could argue that garments green, this green could be stressed. I don't know. We're just going to leave it as it is. But if we get to the last 2 feet, in the twilight. A twilight really is a word that we have equal stress on both syllables, okay? So the 5th foot is a trochet, stressed, unstressed. And the last one is actually called a sponde. because it's two equally stressed syllables. You do not have to know that. I'm just showing you an exception and how to deal with it. Okay? I will be giving you one that's easier than this. So, if you were forced to describe the meter in these lines, you would say that Longfellow primarily uses dactylic hexameter, but does so inconsistently, employing occasional trochets and spondees in place of dactyls. And then you include the scansion so that you can point it out. Okay? And if you read the entire poem, you would see that it is primarily written in this dactylic hexameter, but it's inconsistent. He adds extra syllables here and there. He uses a dactyl, a trochet every now and again instead of a dactyl. It's just not, it's not consistent. So look at some other kinds of variations. A lot of times what you will notice is not that the poet adds a different kind of foot in the line, but merely just ends the line with an extra syllable or begins the line with an extra syllable. So look here. This is just a sentence. You bought the dress I saw this morning. You'll notice the way that I arrange this line. It goes unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed. Uh-oh. So you can see that I have a line that's mostly written in iambic tetrameter, but there's an extra syllable at the end. So you can see I ended with an unstressed syllable, and I should have ended with a stressed. Unstressed, stressed, foot. Unstressed, stressed, foot. Unstressed, stressed, foot. Unstressed, stressed, and then right here would be the end, the foot mark, and now I got this extra. Okay? There's a name for that. We say that this line of verse is iambic tetrameter and has a feminine ending. And there are masculine endings and feminine endings. If the line ends with an extra stressed syllable, it's masculine. And if it ends with an extra unstressed syllable, it's a feminine ending. Okay? All right. Let's look at another example. This is really hard. We're almost done too. So this is the famous line from Shakespeare's Hamlet. Now, Shakespeare wrote in iambic pentameter. So this really should be iambic throughout. It's not. Part of it is and part of it's not. So why don't you take a minute and write this line down and see if you can work out the scansion on your own. So I'm just going to wait a second and let you do that. I'll write it out myself so I know how long it might take. Put the punctuation in as you're writing it. Okay, so once you have it written down, try to figure out where the iambic meter changes. So let's take a look. I noticed when I read this, to be or not to be. There's emphasis on the words be, not, and be. To be or not to be. So these are definitely iams, okay? And then the emphasis here is on the word that. That is the question. So really, what I have is that is the question. Now, here's the argument. Do we have a trochet, an iamb, and a feminine ending? Or do we have a dactyl? That is the question and a trochet. You could make the argument either way. I think the typical understanding is trochet, iamb, and feminine ending, because we do have an extra syllable. And so we have 5 feet with a feminine ending. All right. If you had put down, if you saw these 3 syllables here and then saw this one and you drew the line right here and called it this, a dactyl and a crochet, I would give you credit for that. Okay. But what I want to point out to you is that this pause created right here by the semicolon in the middle of the line, that's called a caesura. Okay, and that's a pause. It's lit term number 123. So whenever you have a pause in the middle of a line, that's a caesura. Okay, so if I were writing about this, I would say that this line contains 3 iambs, separated, actually 4 iambs, separated by a crochet in the 4th foot, and concludes with a feminine ending. Okay, I will never give you anything this hard. This would be like super extra credit. Okay, so what can you expect on the quiz? We'll expect to have at least 2 excerpts of poetry that you need to identify and mark up. So you will complete the scansion of each of the excerpts, and you must identify the meter. You need to know the difference between the 4 basic types of feet, because you never know what I'm going to give you. Iambic, trochaic, dactylic, and anapestic. These will not be on the definitions part of the quiz. They'll be on the part 2. Okay? I will give you excerpts that have a mostly consistent meter. So like very few exceptions. And if there is a consistency, I will make that known and I will ask you to identify it. So I could give you maybe 4 stanzas or something and ask you to figure out the meter. And then I'll say somewhere in these 4 stanzas is an inconsistency. Find it and identify it. Okay? And then the other poetic terms on the list, you also have to identify blank verse, heroic couplet, and quatrain. And once you understand meter and stress, the definitions for these will make sense. I'm not going to go over that in this podcast in the interest of time. And then finally, how can you study? So first thing, just practice marking the accent on ordinary words. Take the word ordinary. Ordinary. If you had to do the scansion of just that word, would that be an iambic or a trochaic word? Okay. You can look up poems and practice. Poems written before the 1800 or the late 1800s are mostly written with a traditional meter. I've given you a list of some poets down here that have poems that are written in a particular meter. So you could look up poems by one of these and practice identifying the meter. Again, you're looking for what do they use most of the time, even though there might be some variations. I'm going to post a worksheet on Canvas that has a poem, or I think 2 poems that you can practice with. And then Thursday morning, I'm going to hold a review session at 7:15 before school, and I'll go over some more examples there, and I'll take any questions that you have. Okay? Hopefully this helps.